Hello and welcome to this episode of the Why We Believe show. Today I'm joined by Russell Osguthorpe. Russell is the former Sunday School General President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's the author of 6 different books and more than 70 articles on religion and education. He was a professor and administrator at BYU, served in a lot of different church leadership positions, holds multiple degrees from BYU, including a PhD in instructional psychology. He's conducted seminars in more than 25 countries. And when he was a young man, he served a mission in Tahiti, and he is in Tahiti right now serving a senior mission as we do this interview. Welcome to the Why We Believe show, where members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints share their inspiring stories of faith and conversion to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm your host, Nathan Gwilliam. Thank you so much for being with us, Brother Osguthorpe.
Great to be with you.
Can you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I grew up in East Mill Creek. This is a suburb of Salt Lake. I actually grew up very close, next door neighbors actually, to President Hinckley.
Okay.
And so his son was my best friend growing up. We were the same age, went through school together. So I saw a lot of the Hinckley's growing up as a young boy and teenager. And then went on a mission to Tahiti at age 19 in 1966. Sometimes people here, they say, well, when did you serve here as a young man? And I said, well, it was 1966 to 68. And they say, wow, I wasn't even born then. And I say, you know what? Nobody was born. I am the only one living that's still here. So this is kind of fun for people because they're just kind of shocked that it was that long ago. We're kind of like 10 years older than most senior couples. I'm actually 20 years older than one senior couple. I told him one day, I said, I could be your father. I'm 20 years older than you. He retired early, came on a mission. So yeah, we've had quite a great time here. In fact, let me just tell you one story that comes to mind when I was a young missionary. We were serving in Tupoi at the time. This is the island where Addison Pratt came in 1844 to open the first foreign-speaking mission of the church. We were teaching a young man. He was probably about our age. He was probably about 20, and we were 20 at the time. And we were in his home, and I was right in the middle of the Joseph Smith story when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I kind of turned around. Oh, there was a rifle pointed straight at my head.
Oh, my goodness.
And his father said, you get up right now, get out of my house, and I never want to see you in my house again. And so we complied.
Smart man.
Yeah, it took a lot of decision, but we actually decided to follow his instruction and get out of his house. His house was right next to the church, actually, just across the field a little bit from the church. And the very next day, that young man came and knocked on our door, our little missionary quarters, which was kind of primitive at the time. And he said, I still want to be taught. And I said, after all that with your dad, you want to be taught? I said, it's not good to, cause trouble in the family and everything. If your dad is really against this church, he says, hey, I am a big boy. I want to be taught. So we taught him in the church rather than at his home. And we baptized him, and he became a faithful member of the church. So that was one little encounter we had a long time ago in Tupoi.
I'm glad his dad didn't come hunt you down.
He did not come hunt us down.
You told me earlier that you gained a testimony at 12 and have always believed since then. Can you share with me about that experience, about what happened when you were 12?
I was in my bedroom in Salt Lake at the time, East Mill Creek, and I was reading the Book of Mormon, and it wasn't as if I had knelt down and prayed about it or anything like that. It was a sudden, unexpected witness that the book was true. And even myself at that time, I thought, maybe I'm too young to know this is true. Like this, I'm only 12 years old. And then I thought, no, I know this is true just as much as if I had been there with Joseph in the grove. And literally, that witness has never left me. I have built on that, tried to build on that all of my life. We read the Book of Mormon every day in French. We've been reading it in French every day for several years, actually. Compare the English with the French, try to get as much as we possibly can out of the book. And it still lifts me, inspires me, tests me, tries me in a sense, makes me think, makes me pray, makes me want to know more all the time. So, yeah, that initial witness has just grown over the years.
I love that. Tell me about growing up near President Hinckley, being around his family, and
Okay.
maybe observed him in his family life setting, maybe not his prophetic setting. Was there anything about your experiences with him that stood out to you?
They were such real people, totally down to earth, totally approachable, accepting. Marge Hinckley was kind of like a second mother to me. My mother was working at the time. I spent a great deal of time in their home. I was kind of fascinated by one of their rooms. He had actually built this. There used to be a patio, and he built onto this patio a study, basically, a library. And he had lots of books. Of course, President Hinckley was a reader, a very thorough, educated prophet. And I remember looking one day at his shelf of books, and one of the books was by Bryant S. Hinckley. Well, Bryant S. Hinckley was his father, and he lived kind of up the way a little bit, and we used to go swing on his swing. And I knew him, and I saw this book on his shelf, and I thought, hey, I actually know someone who wrote a book. And, it was published by Deseret Book. This book is still out there. It's called Not by Bread Alone. And it's a beautiful book. It was then, still is. And his father was quite a distinguished white-haired man that kept outliving his wives and remarrying and stuff. He was a marvelous human being. And so I spent a lot of time in their home. Would watch Marge Hinckley come out and drive us when we were too young to drive. She would get her cushion so that she could see over the steering wheel, because she was a very short, small woman. And looking for her glasses. Where'd I put my glasses? I got to go find my glasses. And she would come with her cushion and glasses, and we would drive off somewhere that she would take us. So, yeah, we were very close to them growing up.
I think he will always be my prophet. He's the prophet I've resonated most with of all the prophets.
Yeah.
Just how he saw the world and how he communicated really spoke to my soul.
One story I love about President Hinckley that really shows him, I think, his character. He had Secret Service people when he was prophet. He had to have those Secret Service people come with him when he went out to his old home, right next to where we lived. His daughter eventually bought that and remodeled it, but he wanted to do one day some garden work. So he went out there, got his hoe and shovel, and started working in the garden. The two Secret Service men were standing by, just watching him. And he looked at them and he said, "Are you just going to stand there and watch me do this work? Or are you going to go get a shovel and help me?" Well, of course, President Hinckley, yes. This is President Hinckley, it's kind of like he's right down to earth, literally. He was magnificent.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so you served your first mission in Tahiti. Why did you choose to go on a mission?
I was one of those ones who wanted to go on a mission. I probably since I was 12,
Yeah.
gaining my testimony.
I felt the same way. That's exactly where I was.
Yeah, I was so eager to go. And it was a tough time to go on a mission because it was Vietnam. And at that time, each ward could send only one missionary on a mission every 6 months. And my good friend who lived across the street from me, his name was Kent, his birthday was in January and mine was in December. And only one of us could go really during that 6-month period. And I thought, wow, how's this going to work out? Because I want to go on a mission so bad. But one day he came to my house and he said, okay, I've got this all solved. I'm going into the Marines. I said, you're what? He said, I've enlisted already in the Marines. I said, did you tell your parents? You have enlisted already? Yep, I've enlisted in the Marines. I'm going to go in the Marines.
Did that so you could serve on a mission?
Kind of. I mean, it was like he was not actually preparing to go in a sense himself. He didn't know if he wanted to go or not. So this all solved everything. He went in the Marines and served a mission in Vietnam. I mean, in his way, he served his mission in Vietnam.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I was serving in Tahiti. Got shot, got a Purple Heart, came home early because he got wounded several times. Anyway, very different experiences we had during those 2 years. And just as a side note, my grandson got back not too long ago from a mission in Vietnam, serving as a missionary for the church in Vietnam, the same place that my friend went to way, way back.
And now you're serving back in Tahiti. How is it different? How did serving in Tahiti as you were young and now as you're a senior missionary, how has that impacted your faith?
Actually, it's hard to describe because when you come back to some place, I told my wife before we came, I said, everyone has passed away that I knew on my mission. They're all gone because they're my age or older. And if they're older, they're gone. So we got back here and they're not all gone, I'll tell you, this is a funny encounter. If you want a little humor,
yeah, please.
I wanted to see the wife and both the husband and wife that we met when he was in Area 70 and we were serving in the Sunday school. We came down here and did a training in several places. And he was one person that we've been here all this time and I hadn't been able to see them. And I came out of the temple and there they were. I thought, I've been wanting to see you for 15 months here, and here you are. And I said, where's your wife? And he said, she's over there talking with that other woman. I went over there, and the woman she was talking with looked at me, and she looked at my tag, and she says, oh, by the way, I didn't put my tag on. I should have put my tag on. Yeah. So I looked at this woman, and she looked up at me, and she said, oh, Elder Osguthorpe. I said, yeah. She said, I remember you. I said, you do? Really? That far back? 60 years ago. This is 60 years ago. She said, yeah, I remember you. I said, yeah. She says, I sang in your choir. I led a choir when I first got here. And we went on cruiser ships and did these shows. And the mission president wanted me to lead this choir because he knew that I was a singer. So she says, you were the best leader of a choir. She says, oh, that was so great. And she was 15. I was 19 at the time. And she said, oh, man, if I were to translate her French, she would have said, oh, I had a crush on you. You were one handsome dude. She says, oh, my gosh. She said, you were so good looking. She goes on and on. Like,
in front of your wife there.
Well, yeah, and in front of this other woman who was standing there, and the other woman just started laughing, and the woman talking, she says, no, she says, I got to be honest. She said, he was something else. What I should have said was, hey, what about now? This was my funniest encounter. Another encounter I had, I was at this reception thing. These two old guys came up. They're all old as I am. So they came up, and the one put his hand on my arm, and he said, it is really you. It's actually you. We remember you when you were a missionary. I heard you'd come back to Tahiti. I can't believe it. He kept stroking my arm. I said, yeah, this is me in the flesh. I said, I am alive. You're alive. And here we are. We're both on the same side of the veil here. And it was, these encounters have been, this woman came up to me one day and she said, hey, I remember when you were on your first mission, you sang a solo, Oh Holy Night, in the big Wharipiti chapel thing. And I said, I had forgotten about that. I thought back and I thought, I do remember. I do remember doing that. And she said, oh, yes, I remember you doing that 60 years ago. I've had a number of these kinds of experience. The temple president just got set apart. He comes in and he says, I sang in your choir when I was a young boy.
Wow.
It's it has been such an interesting thing to be, I don't know, full circle, to come back to associations that have been basically non-functional, kind of severed in a way, but never severed. Just kind of on hold, almost in hibernation, these relationships. And then you come back and here you are again. One day I was in the kind of the entryway of the church office building. And when I got released as a Sunday school president, I hadn't had a chance to say goodbye to President Nelson. And I'd said goodbye to almost all the other general authorities that I'd worked with, but he was the one that set me apart and everything. So I said, "Oh, President Nelson, I'm so glad to see you because I never got a chance to thank you and to say goodbye." And he said, "Oh, in this church, we never say goodbye. Never." And I thought, yeah, here's President Nelson teaching me at every moment. And you say, no, in this church, we don't say goodbye. We just will see each other in a different setting, either on this side of the veil or on the other side. We'll see each other again. We never, ever say goodbye. I loved that phrase.
Yeah, it's a profound point. One of the stories that we talked about before we hit record on this interview, was about your younger brother, who spent a little bit of time away from the church and has come back. Would you feel comfortable sharing that story with us?
We grew up. We were in the same bedroom growing up, and we were close. He was 4 years younger than I was, so we didn't have the same kind of group that we ran around with. And he had a little bit of a difficult time as a teenager, had some problems, was not going to go on a mission at a certain point, but then he did finally decide to served a mission in New Zealand, and came home from that and married. They got married in the temple, were sealed, and had 8 children, big family. But somewhere along the way, he decided the church was not for him, and I would say made quite a clean break from the church. We didn't really talk much about the church. He was out of the church for 33 years. It's a long time. My 2 sisters and I really did not think that we would see the day. I mean, this shows how much faith we really don't have. We didn't really think we would see the day when he would come back into the church. He got to a point where he would say, I don't really believe in God, and the church is not for me. And we stayed close as a family. We would get together. And in his words, we never criticized him as siblings. My parents didn't really fully understand what was going on before they passed away, but so he really just had his siblings to kind of bring him back. And so if he were telling this story, he would say, I wrote this book called Filled with His Love, and I called him up one day and I said, would you like a copy of this book I just wrote? And he said, I don't read. What he meant by that was, I don't like to read. I don't read books very much. And I said, that's okay. I said, if you don't want one, that's all right. Totally. No problem. I said, I just thought if you wanted one. He says, no, because you wrote it, I want a copy. I said, okay, I'll send you a copy. So he got a copy. And surprisingly, about 2 weeks later, he had gotten most of the way through it. And he started asking me questions and everything. And at one point he called me, he says, let me see if I get this straight. What you're saying is, if you want to have good relationships with your family or with anybody else, with friends or anybody, first you got to have a relationship with God. I said, actually, that's the whole point of the book. Work on your relationship with God. And when that relationship is close, you are going to enhance or develop relationships with others that are marvelous. He had some problems with relationships in his family, and that's kind of what drove him, I think, probably to read my book and to start thinking about improving his family situation. Then he said, I don't have a relationship with God. That's my problem. I have no relationship with, he says, what do I do? I said, well, you could pray. Start by praying. He said, I haven't prayed for 30 years. I said, you'll remember. I said, get on your knees. You'll remember how to do it. because 30 years ago you did. So you'll remember. So he called me back the next day and he said my first prayer. I said, you did? I said, how did it go? He said, I think God was shocked. He said, who is this? You know, and he said, but it actually, he said, it felt good. I said, good. I said, it'll always feel good to pray. It'll always feel good. So just hold on, keep going. And so he didn't go back to church still for quite a while. One day I called him and said, do you want to come to General Conference? Actually, this is when I had just been called. This was kind of happened before this, but I had just been called as Sunday school president. So I was supposed to be sitting up in those daunting red chairs that everybody sits. So I invited him because I had a ticket. And that was before I knew I was going to be called to be a Sunday school president. Anyway, so I said, now what do I do? Because I don't want to sit up there and have him sit way down in that audience, a quarter mile away from me. And so I called the Office of the First Presidency and I said, would it be possible at this, it was a priesthood meeting at the time in the evening. I said, would it be possible for me to sit with my brother rather than in the chairs that I've just been sustained to? He said, oh, by all means. He said, absolutely. If your brother, it's going to be good for your brother. He said, you just go ahead and no problem. You don't have to sit up there. Be with your brother. Which I thought was, I don't know, it's a kind of a sign of the true church.
That's right. It's put our priorities in the right place.
So I sat with him that day. This was quite a bit before I ever wrote this book. And afterwards, I said, what did you think of the meeting? He says, I like that German dude. Yeah, Elder Osguthorpe. But he really didn't relate to the meeting very much at all. And it took years after that. Then I wrote this book. He read the book. And finally, he said, one day, he said, he says, I want to see these church buildings that they've built this church building on Social Hall Avenue. It looks like an office building, but it has a steeple on it. And I wouldn't mind going to church there. So he hadn't gone to his own ward yet. I said, yeah, I'll come up. We're sitting there in this chapel. And he said, this is the first time I have attended sacrament meeting in 33 years. I said, how does it feel? He said, it feels good. I like it. And eventually he went back to his own ward. When he went back to his own ward, these magnificent people in his ward, I will be grateful to them my whole life. Absolutely astounding how they embraced him. They heard he was coming back to church. They said, oh, you're going to be sitting with us. And I can't go into that story. It's a long story, but this family could have had some resentment toward him, actually, but instead absolutely loved my brother. And they've kind of been like, I don't know, second parents to him or something. They're just wonderful souls. And then his next door neighbor across the street embraced him. His bishop was amazing. This is the best example of how to integrate somebody coming back that I have ever witnessed in my life. His bishop invited him in one day and said, I just want to give you the questions for a temple recommend. I'm not giving you a recommend interview. You don't have to be nervous or anything. Let's just kind of go over them and see where you stand. Because maybe someday you want to go back to the temple. By this time, he'd been to church a number of times. And he got to the end, and my brother said, well, we got a little problem with the tithing thing because my wife is positive toward the church and doesn't want to pay tithing. And he says, well, you could just pay tithing on your amount of the income. And they talked about that. And so then the bishop said, so you're in good shape by now to get a temple recommend. And he said, well, maybe I could just wait until the Salt Lake Temple's done and then go through. He said, you could do that. Or maybe how about this coming year? How about that? In 2024, that was.
Plenty of other choices, 363 other temples you could go to.
He lives very close to the Bountiful Temple. And So
Actually, there's not 360. That's how many have been announced or in construction.
that's right. They're all over the place. So he eventually got a recommend, went back to the temple. Another year later, now it's 3 years that he's been back in the church. He's now a worker in the Bountiful Temple. So he's serving in the temple and also goes as a patron. He said the other day, he said, the temple has been so powerful in my life. He was invited by his neighbor, his elders quorum president, and now he's been called into the elders quorum presidency after. So here he is. 3 years ago, he was agnostic, and now he's a member of the elders quorum presidency and working in the temple. And it's been the most remarkable transformation I have ever seen in my whole life. I don't know if anyone's ever had this kind of turnaround. I feel like I'm talking to a different person when I talk to him. We talk every week for sometimes a long time. And it's been miraculous to see what's happened in his life. So that's a little bit about my brother. And this could go on forever, but he's so positive about the church, about the temple. He told me that his neighbor invited him to go to the last session of conference on Sunday, and they had tickets. And he said, we're getting in the elevator, and there were these young women outside the elevator just before we got in, and they were giggling and giggling. He says, I asked them, so what are you laughing about? And they said, oh, we thought, wouldn't it be fun to sing I Am a Child of God when we get on the elevator? And so he said they got in the elevator and nothing happened. And he said, he looked over at them. He says, well, are you going to do it? Are you going to start? And he said, they didn't do anything. And he said, so I started. I started saying, I am a child of, and pretty soon he said the whole elevator, he says, we were packed body to body. And the whole elevator is starting to sing, I'm a child of God. And he said, after it was over, he says, I looked at him and I said, and do you believe that? Do you really believe you're a child of God? I told him, I said, come on. I said, you're giving Elder Kieran's talk before the meeting happened. He said, well, he said, for me, I never really understood. I did not understand that I was really a child of God. He said, it makes all the difference in the world. He said, I cried my way all the way through, Elder Kieran, because he said it's everything to really understand that you are his offspring.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about my brother.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Brother Osguthorpe, can you share with me one of the hardest things you've had to go through in your life and how your faith helped you get through it?
It's an amazing thing, but it's actually one of the hardest things I think my daughter ever had to go through, and that was her divorce. This happened a long time ago, and now she is just doing wonderfully well in every way. But that was really a trying moment for me and for my wife, to feel somewhat helpless at how we could be a support to her during a very difficult time. In these desperate moments, your faith is the only thing you have to hold on to. You can't hold on to external things. Material things outside of yourself are of really no use. So you hold on to God. And we held on. And we did all we could to help her. And eventually, the Lord blessed her, blessed us, and blessed their family. She remarried, and he had 2 children, and one of the children was profoundly, severely disabled, could not feed herself, could not move, could not talk. And my daughter helped raise her for a number of years before she passed away at an early age, along with his other daughter, who my daughter, I think, has had such great influence on. Our daughter has had, that particular daughter, our children are, they're all like this. They are just outstanding disciples, each one. And she particularly has helped other women who have had to go through a divorce face the battle and win the battle eventually. So that, I think, is it's a faith promoting experience. Now that we look back on it, at the time, it was excruciatingly difficult.
Yeah. Some of our hardest challenges as parents is seeing our children go through hard things.
Yeah, that's right.
Brother Osguthorpe, can you share with us, why do you believe?
That's easy, actually. I believe because I see his hand in my life every day. We used to tell our missionaries, look for the hand of the Lord every single day, and you'll find it. It's like when I came out of the temple that day and I wanted to see those people that I hadn't seen for a long time. And there they were. All kinds of divine rendezvous happen in the temple. I can't even count them all. But these are moments when the Lord says, I'm here. I'm with you. I acknowledge you. I know you. I know you have needs. And I'm doing what I can to help you in the very best way. So I think that's why I believe. Sister Hinckley one day said, I have seen the manifestations of the Lord in so many ways, I could never, ever deny it.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat like me. If someone came up to ask me, why are you a member of this church? I would say, hey, I wish you could all be members of this church. If you're not a member right now, I wish you could be. Because what you're missing is so precious, so priceless, that my brother is actually the greatest evidence of anything about this. Outside the church, coming back into the church, and the transformation, the change in his life is unmistakable. Absolutely. Anyone who's been around him for these years, it is unmistakable. He used to be, I told him one day, I said, you used to really kind of be depressed a lot of the time. And now, look, you are so, full of hope and joy and love, compassion. It's a beautiful thing. So that's why I believe. I believe in this church because it changes people, because God changes people. That's why I believe.
I love it. It's true. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah.